A monument that exists in South India, a temple that is in pretty good shape, has changed probably very little since it was built at the beginning of the 8th century. These ideas I'm sharing with you are part of a large and rich debate about this monument and many other monuments. So my focus is on the visual and physical evidence of this temple complex, its sculpture, architecture, painting where that survives, and inscriptions carved into the monument during its construction. I am pursuing a full tilt kind of thinking that I understand as fundamental to art history, and that is close, hard looking, what the scholar Yves-Alain Bois has called purposeful and extreme myopia. I have also investigated other visual and verbal materials produced in the same region and period. I prefer to allow for the option that this monument could expand our view of the world of the 8th century, filling in some of the gaps that other sources leave open. I find that close looking has much to teach me about this monument that I have not learned from other sources. I've been asking myself what it can mean to interpret a temple. I especially want to explore what and how a building conveyed meaning for the people who built it, and to those who first moved through its spaces, past its sculptures, paintings, and the words written on its walls. Knowing the monument was going to be about making things hold still, fixing them in a solid casing of truth. Now I find it more useful and more responsive to the cues the monument puts out to let meaning there operate in a fluid, flexible, and multiple way. Not an infinite number of patterns, the temple's designers were dedicated to expressing a specific set of parallels between the monument's royal patrons and the deities housed inside the temple. But I see the visual and physical forms carrying that meaning in fluid relationships between visual and physical materials. So here is a Google Earth screenshot to give you a general sense of the temple's location on the South Asian subcontinent, and a satellite shot of the modern city taken in 2009. The Kailasanatha Temple complex lies outside the western edge of the 8th century city's street grid, and this map is a 20th century map that makes that grid a little easier to see. The temple complex was constructed within a quarter century, and probably less, under the patronage of at least 3 members of the Pallava royal family. Members of the Pallava dynasty had claimed authority over large portions of southeastern India since at least the 6th century, forming alliances and competitions with other royal groups on their borders, much like the kings of medieval Europe. This is the first structure any of the Pallavas had built of separate pieces of stone. Their earlier temples had been monolithic, hollowed out of rock cliffs or boulders. I call this an influential South Asian monument because it is the oldest surviving structure to translate this South Indian architectural paradigm, the pyramidal superstructure set on a cubic shrine, into this grand scale. That paradigm informs most sacred architecture that would be built in the Tamil region for the next 1,000 years. And I say temple complex because it consists of at least 4 8th century structures. One of these 4 structures is the string of small shrines wrapping around the courtyard. These are seen in green on the plan in front of you. Scholars call this string the prakara. A slightly larger version of those shrines stands in the eastern break in the prakara wall, seen here in gray, a temple dedicated by the Pallava prince Mahendravarman III. The structure at the rear of the compound, and under the huge pyramidal tower, is a much larger version of the Prakara shrines. Scholars call this the Vimana. The structure closest to the camera in this shot they call the Mandapa. It is a pillared hall that was open on 4 sides before renovations after the 14th century inserted another hall, shown in gray on this plan, joining the mandapa to the vimana. When you step into the space where I took this picture, sculptural and architectural form surrounds you. Multitudes of columns and walls and cornices and figures of animals and gods and goddesses, all of which were originally covered in bright paint, project at you from all sides, demanding your attention, pulling your gaze and your body in multiple directions at once. No matter how compelling the material in front of you is, there's always something else fascinating in your peripheral vision and behind you, and you know that. The intense visuality and physical complexity of this environment encourage you to move, and not in a simple linear direction, but back and forth between the prakara, mandapa, and vimana, and in and out of many cavities hollowed into each of these structures. When you do move, yet more options for looking and moving open up before you, and each choice you make will set the components you see in different relationships to each other and to you. Movement multiplies exponentially the already wide variety of things there are to see. And visitors are not the only mobile elements at this monument. The buildings themselves seem to be in motion. Brocades of undulant organic form dematerialize every support surface. Even the columns, the rhetorical weight-bearers of the architecture's skeleton, depend on the curved bodies of active lions. On the vimana, these lions even rise up and lunge away from the wall, and cavorting dwarves form a running band of constant activity around the vimana's lowest basement molding, animating this towered stone structure just at the point at which it could rest on the ground. Dancing, running, fighting ganas along the bottom molding, all around the vimana. Yet another kind of motion animating this monument and keeping it in flux is the motion of the sun. Over the course of a day, and from season to season, light dramatically alters the sculptures and their relationships to each other. The orientation of the building indicates that these light shifts are no accident. The ways they change the monument are purposeful, a calculated multivalence, not an anarchy. Designers planned for the sun to hit the south-facing sculptures with maximum force and to cast the north-facing sculptures in deepest shadow at midwinter. Note the arrow on this plan which points to the north. The building is not aligned simply to face east. It faces southeast so that its entryways face a spot on the horizon where, it seems likely, I have yet to test this out, where the sun rises on the winter solstice. As the sun tracks through that day, it remains closer to the southern horizon than it does any other day, its light hitting the monument's southern wall at an angle that is almost horizontal. Here is a recess on a south-facing wall of the vimana in December at mid-morning. The tan stone is so bright it becomes painful to look at. Here it is on a winter afternoon. The contrasts within the day are also heightened at midwinter, particularly on the south. Here is the same figure on a summer morning. In that season, south-facing walls catch only slightly more light than the north-facing ones because the sun is directly overhead, illuminating both sides evenly. Here is a north-facing wall on the same day. But the raking winter light casts that wall in deep shadow. Note the severe backlighting on the right. I took this photo in the middle of the day. The photo records even more sculptural detail than I was able to see when I shot it. Here is the same contrast at the other end of the same north-facing wall, seen here in winter and here in summer. The same light shifts change your experience of the prakara wall around the outer edge of the compound. Here it is in winter and here in summer. All this mobility of light, of visitors, and at least rhetorically of the central tower itself, rearing on lions and set into motion by constantly dancing dwarves, all of this mobility sets the monument's visual signs in motion too, I would argue. And their motion opens up their potential meanings. Meaning in this temple complex does not hold still any more than you can. This is one of the most pervasive webs within this temple complex. It embraces most of the sculptures on the north and south walls of every structure in the complex. The subject matter of most sculptures on these surfaces is organized by the direction the figures face, not by the region of the compound they occupy. In other words, many subjects at this temple are depicted more than once. In most cases, they are repeated, not on the same side or corner or area of the plan, but facing in the same direction. For example, this group of Shiva, seated with his wife beside him, faces south from the prakara's north wall. The subject recurs on the south wall of the vimana, some distance across the compound, but where it is still facing south. Sculptural subjects that face north from the prakara's south wall, and this one is Shiva destroying Kala, or time, or death. These subjects recur on the north wall of the vimana, where they still face north. All of the north-facing sculptures, moreover, portray inauspicious scenes of conflict and triumph. All the south-facing sculptures portray auspicious subjects, like couples in union and beneficent rulers on their thrones. Seasonal shifts have a profound impact on this web of signs. The messages from this consistent set of signs shift with the motion of the sun. The steeply angled winter light sharpens contrasts between the two categories, bathing in sunshine the tranquil figures facing south and cloaking in forbidding shadows the warriors facing north. But relatively even light of the summer reveals similarities between north-facing and south-facing figures. Shiva's yogic grace, his ability to overcome all manner of obstacles, the equivalent magnitude of regenerative and destructive power. Here are the qualities of this god that persist in all seasons, all situations, all narratives temple sculptures evoke. I learned to think this when I visited the monument in summer after having seen it only in winter light for years and years before. This web is, moreover, not exclusive. Sculptures that participate in this web also participate in other webs. Such figures seem to me to be hinged between multiple webs, slipping from one to another as the light shifts or the moving viewer perceives them from a new angle. Thus, some webs interweave and cross-cut, sharing some figures, diverging around others. This figure of Shiva as a handsome mendicant, Bhikshatana, participates in the south-facing theme of auspiciousness through his seductive interactions with the smitten women who have thrown themselves at his feet. He also participates in another web, and this is the one that I want to show you in some detail. This web is about circumambulation, that practice common to Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, and Islam, just to name a few, that practice in which the faithful walk around the object of their devotion. We have assumed that clockwise circumambulation has always been the norm at Hindu temples. We assume this because this tends to be the norm at Hindu temples now, and it often seems to be supported by the sculptures that we find on temples. So it's in all the textbooks. Of course, you always walk in this clockwise direction, pradakshina. But sculptures at the Kailasanatha Temple encourage the opposite direction of movement just as much, to come at the structure from this angle, that is. Instead of there being just one way to experience this monument, I think there were at least two. And one inverted the sequence the other established for revealing the monument's signs. The signs could unfold in opposite directions. The pieces could fit together in a different way, and that could change their meaning. Viewers could have quite heterogeneous experiences, and that looks like it was part of the plan. The visual cues to movement that I find are moreover paired, with cues that encourage the opposite kind of movement. Their pairing suggests a balancing or counterposing of these two kinds of movement, as if to hold clockwise and counterclockwise circumambulation in dialogue or tension, or perhaps to express inversion. One element of the pair undoes or undermines or reverses the other. Now, to show you some of these visual cues to movement. This figure encourages you to clockwise movement through several devices. One is by example. He mimes walking in that direction. If you faced as this orange arrow does, you would see him moving to your left. By facing that way and moving that way, he makes that direction seem interesting. And if you follow him, you will find yourself rounding the southwest corner of the Vimana, and you will encounter him again, this time inside one of the 9 small temples embedded in the Vimana's exterior shell. Bhikshatana's presence pierces the stone wall, as it were, manifesting on the exterior wall and then the interior heart of the shrine attached to the Vimana's southeast corner. It is as if he walked through that shrine's stone wall, or that his presence radiates through it, manifesting on the exterior as if the intervening stone wall were transparent or liquid or a rear projection screen. In both cases, he practices and models clockwise circumambulation. He walks toward the viewer's left when we first see him, and if we follow him in the same direction, we find him again, still walking toward our left. The repetition intensifies our perception of his movement. A single figure can promise motion, 2 figures can offer proof that it happened. He actually moved from one to the next. His walking form traversed space and cut through stone. This implies something magical about him, his movement, and that space. This sculpture also encourages you in more subtle ways to walk toward your left. The twist of Shiva's torso pulls you in that direction. You see his hips as if you stood a little behind him, his waist as if you had pulled even with him, and his shoulders as if you had moved ahead of him. By collapsing these different perspectives into his single contour, his figure can imply your movement around him. This movement unfolds in a leftward, clockwise direction if your eye moves from bottom to top, and that is a likely direction for your eye to move since his feet are just above eye level. The strong line of his near leg leads your eye up toward his hips, and along the way, that leg also points left, and he looks back over his shoulder, perhaps making eye contact with those who would stand at his feet, and rewarding them with a beautiful smile. These encourage us to follow him. That he is also making a hand gesture with his near arm reinforces the sense he means to communicate with us. The object of that pointing gesture can further encourage clockwise movement, especially if this is not the first time you have seen the monument. The gesture catalyzes a foreshadowing moment. The meaning of the upward gesture could have different significances. The visuality of it certainly takes the eye up to another sculpture of Shiva dancing on one knee. That figure, like the wandering figure, will appear on the west wall. Shiva in both of these forms carries on around the Vimana. From the south to the west wall, toward our left, his own feet pointing toward our left as well. A similar dynamic occurs on the northwest corner of the Vimana, but this time movement leads just as clearly in the opposite direction, counterclockwise circumambulation or apradakshina. There, Shiva rides on a chariot, fully armed as if into battle. Most people now read this as Shiva Tripurantika, riding into battle with his army to destroy the enemy's city. We read the figure close beside him as the god Brahma piloting the war chariot. Shiva leads us to the right by example. He lunges that way, and with the abstract lines of the composition. The diagonal thrust of his torso, his bent leg, forward arms, and royal parasol. His face turns a quarter to the right too. His charioteer leans toward our right. The three rotund figures beneath him charge to our right, waving weapons, and the goddess ahead of him, as it were, points in the same direction. So does the rearing lion she is riding. If you move in the direction they do, you round the northwest corner of the Vimana and find that Shiva again pierces the wall to emerge into the back of an attached shrine. In this case, the illusion of piercing is even more vivid because he enters in profile and emerges in a frontal view. We have walked around him, but he has continued moving in a single direction, straight through the back wall of the attached shrine. Bhikshatana, by contrast, remained in profile in both panels. He was always walking with us. Tripurantika rode with us and then toward us. But this dramatic device of wall piercing is otherwise quite similar in these two cases, and sets these two pairs of sculptures in dialogue with each other. These two sets of doubles are further paired by their placement on the Vimana. They frame the western wall between them. That symmetry on the ground plan tempts me to see a deliberate quality to their pairing, and to the opposite kinds of movement each pair encourages. The Tripurantika figure of Shiva, too, is hinged by the same two webs that Bhikshatana is, articulating in one the importance of conflict as he readies for war in the grim winter shadows of the north-facing wall, and balancing in the other his counter-clockwise movement against the clockwise circumambulation of his mendicant form. Other pairings also invite pradakshina and apradakshina in alternation. Recall the dancing figure above Bhikshatana, and then again on the western wall. In both of these, Shiva's body lunges to our left, but the same figure occurs on the east wall, moving in the opposite direction. And he appears at the opposite end of the east wall, his pose flipped left to right yet again. Mirror images flank the two ends of the Vimana's facade, which would have been easier to see before the later attachment of the intermediate hall obscured the unity of that facade. On each side, Shiva lunges toward the outer end of the wall, a forceful set of diagonal lines to carry our eyes to the left or right, and perhaps a model for our circumambulation. Here at the facade, a most likely place to begin circumambulation, they lead in both directions. There are many inscriptions on the monuments. The ones that are contemporary with the monument's 8th century construction encourage visitors to move in the same two directions that I've just been showing you. The sculptures are encouraging you to move. I'm inferring movement through the direction of the text. All of these inscriptions are written in Sanskrit, which reads from left to right. But some wrap around the outside of buildings, like those marked here in red, and others wrap around the inside, like the one marked here in green. So to read them, you would need to walk in opposite directions. Two inscriptions are associated with King Rajasimha. One wraps in a clockwise direction, the other in a counterclockwise direction. The shifting directions are not the result of different patronage, in other words. Inscriptions ask us to move in many different directions throughout this compound. Like the pieces of glass in a kaleidoscope, these signs lie ready to connect in a range of distinct patterns, each one resolved and structured around its own internal balance. Different shards rise to prominence with each reconfiguration. Dim light emphasizes some colors, bright light highlights others. These shards rely upon motion to bring them into their various alignments, so they will fit together differently depending on how you approach them, when you see them, and who you are. This lets the temple mean different things to different viewers, even within the 8th century, and also to reveal new connections to the same viewer at different times. Every visit could yield new insights. It is indeed difficult to experience this monument the same way twice, even if you try. It certainly rewards repeated visits. I see more every time I look.